Hi everyone, welcome to Cold War Spaces. I'm Anna Rose, the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende. Today's topic is Grassroots Space, German Utopias before and after the Wende. And I'd like to welcome our guest, Jennifer Allen, Assistant Professor of History at Yale University. She's a historian of modern Germany with a particular interest in late 20th century cultural practices. She's currently working on a book manuscript titled In Pursuit of Sustainable Utopia, Art, Political Culture, and Historical Practice in Germany, 1980 to 2000. In a related research project, she traces how Germany's grassroots commemorative practices became a model for international communities as diverse as Moscow and Buenos Aires over the past 30 years. Today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Jennifer and Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, we'll leave about 15 minutes for an audience Q&A. I'd also like to add that due to technical difficulties during the live event, this is a recording done after the fact. And I'd also like to thank Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And I will hand it off to you to get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose. And Jennifer, welcome for the second time to the series Cold War Spaces. Happy to do it again with you. Let's start with the concept of utopianism in Germany in the 20th century, and looking at the century in general. There seems to be a lot of utopian energy. Think of the First World War, which was received by many as a kind of redemption. There were the November revolutions of 1918, the left-wing revolutions. Then, of course, there was the perverted utopian, racial utopian project of the National Socialists. Then again, the generation of 1968 brought an anti-authoritarian utopianism. But it seems that by the 1980s, this whole utopian energy evaporated somewhat. It was the time of President Ronald Reagan in the United States, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, Chancellor Helmut Kohl in Germany, and those are politicians you would not immediately associate with the word utopian. It was also a time, you could also think of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was proclaimed by some to be the end of the Cold War and an opportunity of for someone like Francis Fukuyama to proclaim the end of history even. So not a good time, it seems, for utopia, and actually a lot of writers started to publish about the end of utopia, the death of utopia, etc. But you are taking a completely different take on the 1980s. Can you tell us a little bit about your perspective?
Absolutely. And first, thank you, Yus and Anna Rose, for having me on again. It's a pleasure to have this conversation for a second time. So this is a great question, and I'm going to answer it by really talking about Germany. And as you noted, most of Germany's 20th century was shaped by utopian experiments. Of course, those were punctuated with bursts of pretty strong anti-utopianism in between. And in the post-war period, you mentioned this, the activism of the 1960s, this was a really bright point, a great example of this utopian energy of the 20th century, and a moment that also conditioned in really important ways later utopian thought and practice. But as you mentioned, by the time we get to the late 70s, early 80s, this is a real downer of a moment in West Germany. Two oil crises, not just one, but two in 1973 and then in 1979. And these two events solidly ended the explosion of economic productivity that we subsume under that umbrella, the economic miracle. Germany was also reeling from the terrorism of the so-called German Autumn in 1977 with the Red Army faction, but also a host of other far left organizations that turned to violence as a technique to advance their political agendas. This is also a moment, as you noted, you mentioned Thatcher and Reagan, shaped by neoliberalism, and the strong market orientation of neoliberalism was not particularly conducive to encouraging a sense of agency, economic agency. So it was in this context that Cole sort of enters his chancellorship and announces a return to conservatism. He calls in Germany for a spiritual moral transformation, a geistig-moralische Wende, incidentally of a very different sort than the Wende in the name Wende Museum. And this event was called Utopianism before and after the Wende. We might ask which Wende we're talking about here. But we have this conservative turn, a conservative Wende in the early 80s. So this constellation, it all came together at the right moment. And we see in this moment in Germany a strong dissatisfaction with the political status quo, a sense of, we might say, the kind of ossification of political structures. So you again mentioned Thatcher. Her expression, "there is no alternative," sort of encapsulates the dispiriting moment in which Germans were operating here. And to put this in quantitative terms for those who are more statistically minded, in the early post-war period, about 3/4 of the German electorate was voting for one of the three big German parties, the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, and the Free Democrats, the sort of classical liberal party. By the early 1980s, so when Kohl assumes the chancellorship, that bumps up to 98%. So in a multi-party system that at least nominally professes to offer political choice, choice in this context really seemed more like a mirage for a lot of people. And it was against this backdrop too that Kohl took a pretty strong stance in his chancellorship, keeping his eye on the violence, the radicalism from the left of the late 70s. He took a pretty strong stance against what we might describe as leftist excesses. So this framework, this constellation of conditions, it incidentally united an alternative milieu, in some ways in self-defense. It created, this environment created a space for a need for left activism. So we know here that the status quo, it denied the left a radical alternative. It denied them a utopia, especially if we want to jump forward about a decade to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, especially after the collapse of communism. The left sort of seemed to lack a utopian project, but that simply pushed them to develop new ones. Now, you noted the wave of literature at the end of the Cold War that announced the ends of things. So Fukuyama and the end of history, but also the narrative, including in Germany by the conservative historian Joachim Fest, announcing the end of utopia. We know in this context that old utopian forms, those had largely been discredited by the violence of the 20th century. You can't radically change society as a whole. We know now that totalizing plans end in bloodshed. But I want to suggest that this moment was not, in fact, the final end of utopia, as those writers, thinkers, disaffected public intellectuals wanted us to believe. Macro utopias were out. But what you see when you look on the ground in the 1980s and in the 90s is a move toward a different kind of utopian thinking and utopian practice, a move away from the macro toward what we might describe as micro utopias, utopian projects that operate in finite areas of society. They're small, but they're not reformist. They're projects with a radical aim to create a kind of superlative future in a defined area of society. And so in some ways, the late 20th century also, as well as this conservatism, inadvertently brought about a change in the very concept of utopia, the way that society thinks about utopia.
All right. a form of utopianism, and actually in your forthcoming book you have some fascinating case studies from very different backgrounds. Let's start with the Green Party, which actually broke the deadlock in the political landscape in West Germany. Why do you consider the Green Party utopian, given the fact that in a parliamentary democracy parties always present their own visions? What makes the Green Party so special in this respect?
Yeah, great. Thank you. This is a fantastic question. I want to preface my remarks here. I want to be very careful. There are green parties in many governments around the world, and I want to be careful not to suggest that the Greens are in some ways, that environmentalist parties are in some ways inherently utopian, although I will also say that one could argue the concept of sustainability itself has a utopian element to it. But what struck me about the early West German Greens, and I'll use Greens a little loosely here, they didn't formally coalesce under that name until the party was officially created at the federal level in 1980. But the early West German Greens, what stood out to me was that they weren't just an environmental party. Ecology was just one of 4 pillars that helped shape the party's platform. The other 3 being grassroots democracy, social responsibility, and also with an eye to the violence of the late 1970s was the pillar of nonviolence. So what stood out in the context of the Greens is that the party, again, wasn't just about ecology, wasn't just about environmentalism. The Greens wanted to fundamentally remake German politics. And this really carries on an ambition from the extra-parliamentary opposition movement of the 1960s, but ironically, within the parliamentary system. So remember the context here. This is a rigid political system in which kind of political technocracy has control. And in this context, a diverse, and I want to underscore that, a diverse group of politically engaged, concerned citizens, they came together and basically said, enough. Again, diverse. The early Greens, before they adopted the name the Greens, one of the sort of tentative names that they were using was the colorful list, the bunte Liste. In Germany, every party has a color, and the use of the colorful list as a name, and I want to come back to the list element in a second, but the use of colorful indicated that they were pulling people from all different political inclinations to these set of values. And again, not just the colorful party, they called themselves the colorful list because they fundamentally rejected the traditional party structure. This was one of many elements that they saw as part of the problem in the traditional parliamentary political system. So not only did they reject the party as a structural element, they also had a range of other ambitions designed to help rebuild a new political world for Germany. They embraced a 2-year rotation system to try to inhibit the creation of career politicians. They embraced and very heavily supported gender parity. I think it's no coincidence that we see a spike in women in the Bundestag when we see the Greens enter the Bundestag in 1983. And they also adopted the imperative mandate, which tied them to the preferences of their constituencies. So these practices, they were all in the name of radically democratizing German politics. So the utopian element of the Greens was to say that all citizens should have a say in politics, all citizens, that politics should take place not at a remove in the parliament building, but rather in local communities, and that we can make these changes and still allow politics to function. I should also note, it's the later Greens, they weren't able to fully sustain these ambitions. They did fall prey to the iron law of oligarchy, when they were forced to choose between, as you noted, between parliamentary power, between simply being a protest movement and being a party with parliamentary power, despite their early rejections of the party infrastructure. And at the end of the day, when they chose to coalition with the SPD, with the Schroeder administration in 1998, they chose compromise over radicalism. But I don't think it's a complete coincidence that we've seen a resurgence of the Greens alongside the resurgence of the far right in Germany. I think voters are turning back in some ways to this aura of the Greens, in which they proclaimed themselves a radical alternative to Germany, but of a different sort.
Right, thank you. You mentioned that according to the Greens, all citizens should have a say in politics. You are also in your forthcoming book speaking about art, and this reminds me a little bit of Joseph Beuys's statement that everyone should be an artist. Of course, Joseph Beuys was actively engaged with the Green movement in the early years. Can you comment on his role a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think part of what you see in this comment, that everyone should be an artist, this very much echoes or imports the investment in radical democratization that you see in the Green Party. Part of a core feature of this new utopianism is this desire to embrace democracy in a kind of plebiscitary sense. And so here what you see, you mentioned Beuys as an early founder of the Green Party. Beuys is also an icon of avant-garde art. So he really bridges with the statement these two different worlds of environmentalism, or the politics of the Greens, which I want to note are larger than environmentalism, but also this world of art.
Right. Then another aspect, art aspect, you're researching is grassroots monuments and grassroots memorials. Maybe the most famous example is the Stolpersteine, the stumbling stones project from Gunther Demnig. And you were also speaking about the Orte des Erinnerns, the places of remembrance by Renata Stie and Frieder Schnock. Could you explain how you see these grassroots monumental projects being part of this utopian atmosphere in the 1980s and 90s?
Sure. So this whole project started with an interest in art, especially with an interest in memorials. Art does work in the world, and I wanted to spend some time thinking about what work that was in the late 20th century. In the end of the 20th century, it's a really fascinating, a really cool moment in the art world. Artists during this period, they're revisiting, rethinking old themes. So you see in the late 20th century, a rejection of commodification, a rethinking of the sites of art. So there's a return, for example, to the concept from the late 70s of the white cube, the sort of constraining grasp of the gallery space, and a current desire to break free from those chains. And so along with that, you see a revival of art in the style of the land art movement, a style of art from the 60s and 70s that also tried to explode the bounds of the gallery by creating art that was far too large to contain within it, art that was so big you needed to walk it, to inhabit it, rather than simply to see it, to observe it. There was also a rethinking of public engagement, the question of who makes art. So we talked about Beuys. Another important concept from Beuys was the notion of a social sculpture, art that wasn't simply the product of one single genius artist, but rather art that was the product of social dialogue, art that emerged collectively. And it's great that you mentioned the stumbling stones. They're one excellent example, but I want to talk about a couple of others too, the Orte des Erinnerns, places of remembrance. But I'd also like to talk about briefly another example from Joseph Beuys. So I suspect that most of our viewers have some basic familiarity with the stumbling stones, but this is a really remarkable project. From the early 1990s, a product of sort of quirky artist Günter Demnig, who decided to undertake the project of commemorating every individual victim of the Holocaust with a sort of personalized mini monument, we might say. And those monuments, they're a brass-covered cobblestone engraved with the name, date of death, date of birth, date of death, and place of death of a single victim of Nazi persecution. And interestingly, Demnig, he chooses to place these monuments before the last freely chosen residence of one single victim. And these features of this monument, they push back against many of the classical features of sort of traditional monuments. So centralization, anonymization, passive commemoration. So centralization, rather than say conventional monuments like the monument to Germany's National Holocaust Monument, the monument to the murdered Jews of Europe, which is located in the heart of Berlin. These are located in ordinary neighborhoods. The intention here is that you stumble upon, quite literally, you stumble upon the act of the monument and thus the act of remembrance, of commemoration spontaneously, rather than needing to go to a specific site and confine your act of commemoration in some intentional way to that visit to that site. It also combats the act of anonymization, the tendency to emphasize the gravity of Nazi brutality by emphasizing its massivity. And by erasing the individual identities, the millions of individual identities that were lost. Here with the stumbling stones, we see an effort to weave individual existences back into the topography of everyday life. Last, this is a monument that combats or attempts to combat passive commemoration, where one observes an existing monument, but has no real direct engagement with it. The stumbling stones, in contrast to most conventional monuments, this is a project not from the top down, but from the bottom up. Often it's descendants of victims who choose to create stones, but in many cases, it's apartment communities. Often this is a beloved project, sort of equivalent of a senior project for school children, organizations who take on the task of identifying a victim, researching that victim, and funding the creation of a stone. And I want to underscore that this isn't just a micro project. Each individual stone is small, but the project has grown in remarkable ways. So we have these large groups of people who are often involved in the creation of individual stones. And what's remarkable is it's impossible to keep track of the numbers. They change every time I give a talk on this topic. But the last that I saw was that the stumbling stones had crossed the 80,000 stone threshold. So there are 80,000 of these memorials. And behind each of those stones is a group of people who have initiated the project, researched it, funded it, and there are often also large cleaning actions after the fact to keep the stones shiny and noteworthy. And the utopian aspect of this project, what's more utopian than trying to commemorate every single victim of the Holocaust? I also want to note that this project, it's interesting in that it's clearly hit a chord internationally. There are spin-off projects of this initiative in Russia, commemorating victims of Stalin's purges. There is a project in Buenos Aires in Argentina commemorating the disappeared. And there's also a version of this in the United States, two separate versions commemorating victims of slavery, enslaved persons. And what's interesting actually about the US examples is that they remind us that slavery wasn't just an institution of the South, but rather both projects commemorate enslaved people in the North. And so their reach really distinguishes these projects. And I just want to mention two others briefly that share these kinds of qualities, that share these features with the Stumbling Stones. One is a
By the way, the Stumbling Stones are actually quite literally a bottom-up project, right? Because they're on the pavement, on the sidewalk, so you
absolutely
over them, which makes it also so amazing and so impressive, I think.
This is the Stumbling Stones adopt a different power relation between the monument and the viewer. This is not a monument that's designed to overwhelm you as most traditional monuments are. Think of anything on the National Mall, perhaps with the exception of the Vietnam War Memorial. Think of the monument to the murdered Jews of Europe, even something more traditional like the Brandenburg Gate that's designed to impress. The Stumbling Stones adopt a very different approach to the viewer. Absolutely. And there are two other examples that I want to mention, one of which you already raised. This is the Places of Remembrance Monument by Renate Schie and Friedrich Schnack, located in Berlin, in the Bavarian quarter of Berlin, a former Jewish residential neighborhood. This is a project that dates to 1993. And this involves a kind of similar initiative to create a broad topography of memory. What the artists have done is to, this is a monument that commemorates the gradual implementation of anti-Jewish policy in Germany. And they've installed throughout this neighborhood, not just in one place, but throughout the neighborhood, a series of signs. On one side is a pictogram representing the other side, which is a very brief description of a particular law. And they've hung these from light posts around the neighborhood so that you have to walk. There's no sort of single experience of the monument. Rather, it's on the way to the subway, or on your way to the pharmacy, or on your way to, when we're not in a pandemic, a friend's house for coffee, that you stumble upon these reminders of the past and are asked to engage in an act of commemoration. So the point here is to change the encounter with memory, that it's something that happens in daily life, to change not only where, but when, in the temporality of everyday life, and how we remember, as well as who remembers, not just those who choose, but those who stumble upon these monuments, as the case may be. This is part of a trend in Germany to remake memory culture by remaking the landscape. And the last example I just want to touch on briefly is an example that predates either the Stumbling Stones or Places of Remembrance. And this is a project from Joseph Beuys from the early to mid 80s. It was a 5-year project in which he sought to install 7,000 oaks throughout the city of Kassel. And this was also a bottom-up project. It was a monument to the environment, a monument designed to remind us of the destruction brought about to the environment by urban development. And it's a project that continues today. It has a big footprint in the city of Kassel. And again, this was a monument aimed at remaking memory through a collective discursive project and by changing Germany's landscape.
Right, thank you. Fascinating. So far we have been discussing what you could call progressive utopian projects, but of course utopianism can also be found on the right. And actually you mentioned the Margaret Thatcher quote, "There is no alternative." The current populist right-wing party in Germany is called Alternative für Deutschland, an alternative for Germany. Could you say something about what you see as the basic parallels, maybe, and differences between current left-wing and right-wing utopianism in Germany?
Sure. This is a great question, and one in some ways that has, in some form, followed me throughout this entire project, that's dogged me throughout this project. So we've been talking about a handful of examples that we might kind of describe as warm, fuzzy projects of the left. But what I want to suggest is that the methods, the techniques that stand behind them, the techniques that are used to advance these memorials, advance these utopian projects, rather, radical democratization, decentralization, kind of making mundane of the pursuit of these projects. In principle, these are empty practices. They can be filled with a range of values. So of course, the primary difference between the utopias of the left that we've been talking about and the utopias of the right are the values that undergird them. The utopias of the right today embrace often racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, homophobia, etc. But what I want to suggest is that the practices they use are analogous. So you mentioned Alternative für Deutschland, the far right party that has done remarkably well in recent elections. But I would also throw in some sort of less official movements like Pegida, patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the West, a sort of protest movement, as well as the youth activist movement, the identitarians, which are aimed at bolstering a white European identity. They all engage the same techniques as the utopian projects that I've described. They have an affinity for radical expressions of direct democracy. They want to get politics into the streets, into local neighborhoods. Pegida was particularly successful in generating protests that ordinary people attended in their ordinary contexts. They're also concerned with access to a lesser degree, AfD, one sees this more prominently among the youth activists, but it's a common denominator of all of much of the new right, is that they are masters of social media, masters at getting their messages into the hands of ordinary people. And they've also embraced a new rhetoric about the future. They talk about the development of a sustainable new politics of the right. So the point here, I think, is simply, it's great that we have this, what I want to suggest is a new way of thinking and pursuing utopias that has been developing since the end of the 20th century, but we can't get complacent. We can't protect those sets of methods from being used by other, perhaps less palatable sets of values.
Right. Thank you for that. And before we go to the Q&A, I would love to ask you one final question, which makes our conversation very topical indeed. It's about the current, what you could call history war raging in the United States. You thought a lot about the politics of memory, the politics of history. As you know, we now have a situation where the New York Times 1619 project, or Project 1619 as it is called, has been countered by another project from the Trump administration, Project 1776. I know this is not directly your field of research, but as a historian and as also from a personal perspective, what is your take on this current debate in the United States about how to interpret American history?
Yeah, So I am going to answer this question not as a Yale historian, but rather as a concerned citizen, especially because I'm not a specialist in US history. I'll leave the debate about the details to the experts. But my take here is that you called it a history war, that this history war, this intellectual confrontation, as well as our reaction to it, I think tells us a lot about the state of our politics in the United States today. So there is, within each of these projects and in the tension between them, there's a historiographical argument to be made. There are arguments about the ways one analyzes and one writes history, or one should write history. But I want to suggest that that doesn't really concern most ordinary readers. Most ordinary citizens are not engaged with dissecting individual adjectives or lines, breaking apart single paragraphs of large texts in order to make a claim. I want to argue instead that, there's a much more straightforward tension between those two projects. So at core, the 1619 project is about slavery, about enslaved people, and really about the argument that Black Americans lie at the heart of US history. And I should add that a similar argument could be made for other minority groups, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Latin Americans, as well as other minority groups. 1619 is specifically about Black Americans, but one could draw a similar argument. The 1776 project, that's really about pride in US history, and a concern that that pride, by focusing on the things that the 1619 project is calling for, have resulted in a kind of waning pride in the United States. Now, I want to suggest these two things are not incompatible. It's not incompatible to recognize the exploitative institutions at the heart of US history, but also nevertheless to maintain pride, some kind of national pride. This is, of course, a very contentious issue in Germany as well. But the fact that the 1619 project has, in some ways, rubbed against the grain, rubbed as hard as it has, I think suggests that we have our own process of working through the past, mastering the past. The Germans have a wonderful long German word for this project, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the process of mastering the past. I think the tension between these two projects and the virulent responses to them suggests that we still have our own project of working through the past. The core argument that slavery built white wealth is not really contestable. And the institutions that replaced it, from sharecropping to Jim Crow to redlining, these institutions continued to disadvantage Black people. And until we can have a productive conversation about those arguments, again, I still think we're in a process of working through the demons of our own past.
Right, yeah, coming to terms with the past is a continuing challenge. Yeah. We're absolutely right there. Okay, let's go to the Q&A now. We have time for a few questions, and the first is by Bruce Hollihan. He writes, I wonder if the struggle between utopian and anti-utopian thinking has been going on for much longer than we think. Those who are more comfortable with the past are scared and alienated by the philosophies of Beuys, Gramsci, and parties like the Greens. I think that this is an ongoing struggle. What do you think?
I think this is absolutely right. In some ways, the concept of utopianism, which really dates back 500 years to its first coining by Thomas More, utopianism has always been in tension with anti-utopianism. Utopianism always calls forth strong reactions against it. So you're absolutely right there. One of the things that I think is really noteworthy about this new mode of utopian thinking. And I should add that the concept of utopianism, we don't need to get into the details here, but has evolved over its 500-year history. And one of the evolutions that I think we're seeing now is an attempt for utopian projects to be less dogmatic. That is, to find, or to be more flexible, to find ways to accommodate those anti-utopian or even dystopian critics, to incorporate them in some ways dialectically into an ever self-improving concept. Utopianism of this new variety is not a single destination that one aims for and that one could possibly reach sort of once and for all time. Rather, much like the project of sustainability, which I mentioned before, it's an ongoing enterprise and it's always responsive to its environment. So yes, utopianism and anti-utopianism go hand in hand and have for the existence of utopianism as a concept. And I think new forms of utopianism are trying to take that into account.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Samantha Fox, and she writes, "Thanks so much for an excellent talk. I'm wondering if you could speak about East German environmentalism and GDR efforts for environmental protection, which were sometimes motivated by scarcity, as a precedent for contemporary environmental politics." I think that's actually a quite interesting question also because of the completely different context, of course, of the East German environmental movements in a state that called itself utopian. Would you like to reflect on this question?
Yeah, so environmentalism in the East was, of course, a sticky concept. There were instances in which the East had famously disregarded the imperatives of environmentalism. Protecting the environment was just not a key ambition, a key value, and one need only look at, for example, Bitterfeld, the area of Bitterfeld, which is notorious for its pollution, and it's taken quite a long time to reverse those damages. But at the same time, there was, in some ways, the East used environmentalism where it could, especially as a tool in diplomacy vis-a-vis the West. So when air pollution, for example, from factories in the West would carry over because of airflow into the East, then the East became much more concerned with environmental protection or water pollution flowing along rivers, for example. And you're right to note that there's this complicated tension in the GDR. It proclaimed itself a utopian experiment, and many would have had much to quibble with that description. And it's especially in the late 20th century, its environmental practices were one of the areas against which people could lodge complaints.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have time for one final question, which is from Torben Rodost. Do you think that the recent Fridays for Future movement carries enough utopian momentum to be an actual successor of the German Greens?
This is a great question. Had you asked me this question, I don't know, 6 months ago when pandemic restrictions, contact restrictions were loosening, in the summer when people were able in Germany to gather together again, there were a handful of really sizable Fridays for Future protests in Germany, and I would have given you a much more optimistic, at least locally optimistic answer. Unfortunately, I think the reality is that the pandemic has put some really tough constraints on Fridays for Future. Contact limitations, the inability to have large gatherings has really changed their primary technique for getting out their message. So I would have said prior to the pandemic or prior to the second wave of the pandemic, absolutely, I think concerns about climate change and the demand to implement dramatic policies that can dial those changes back or at least slow them down is something that resonates really widely. I think, as I've said, the project of sustainability, but all of these kinds of climate change initiatives are governed by a kind of utopian ambition. I think that's been pretty dramatically tempered by the constraints of the pandemic. But I'll just end on a note of optimism by saying that I have a lot of faith in the youth activists of Fridays for Future. I think that they, as is always the case with dramatic or radical visions for a superlative future, it takes a little bit of time for them to congeal, but I'm pretty confident, especially if the limitations of the pandemic continue, that they're going to find another way to advance the set of values that undergird Fridays for Future.
Great, and on that optimistic note, Jennifer, I want to thank you very much for being my guest again today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, it was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.